guys, it's Sam, and today I'm going to be giving some tips for how to get into science fiction and fantasy for beginners. And this is this week's Booktube SFF Awards Book Babbles. So every week during the award season we are doing a discussion topic for the Booktube SFF Awards that anybody can participate in, so I will leave the link to all the topics down below and you can join in if you want to. So this is a really great topic because I feel like I get this question a lot, kind of posed in two different ways. One is how do I just in general get into science fiction and fantasy, and the other one is how do I get into adult science fiction and fantasy. So I'll kind of be addressing both of those, and they both are very similar tips. It's basically the same tips applied to the different age categories, but I'll give some examples and stuff in there too. You know, I'll be thorough. So the first tip applies to anything in general when you're trying something new, and that is to at least identify something you love and stick to it. So, for example, if you tend to read a lot of literary fiction, there are more literary fantasy or science fiction novels. If you read a lot of historical fiction, there's historical fantasy, etc., etc. So if you happen to read a lot of contemporary YA and you want to get into fantasy, I think a good jump up from that is magical realism. So Anna Marie McLemore is a YA author that writes magical realism. She has a number of books, and I've reviewed a couple of them here on my channel. One of them is When the Moon Was Ours, and magical realism takes place in our world, but magic is real, but like not really paid much attention to. It's not the magic that you see in like fantasy novels. It's just magical things happen and you're not quite sure if they're metaphor or real. And that's kind of the nature of the genre, and people don't make a big deal out of whatever it is. It's just kind of a part of life. So if you're into more contemporary, you know, slice of life stories, magical realism stories are a good step up from that. If you're really into thrillers or detective stories, I think urban fantasy is a good place to go. You have to be kind of okay with more adult situations. Urban fantasy does tend to have a lot more heavy leanings on the romance, but not completely. It's mostly like romance plot and also a lot of like cop drama, you know, people are dying, stuff like that. A lot of the characters in urban fantasy tend to work on like police forces and stuff, at least the ones that I have read, or they're like contracted to work for the police. So if you like those kinds of stories, mysteries, thrillers, that kind of thing, cop dramas, you watch a lot of cop TV shows, CSI, all that stuff, then I think urban fantasy is a good genre to step into. We actually just recently did a topic on urban fantasy. I didn't talk about it because I've only read a few urban fantasy series that I mentioned a lot, but there are a ton of urban fantasy series out there, so go check out other people's book babbles on urban fantasy, and just in general go and check out some urban fantasy. There's so many urban fantasy series, it's not going to be hard to jump into those. If you're into historical fiction, maybe Temeraire by Naomi Novik. This is the Napoleonic Wars with dragons. There's nothing really different about them besides the dragons, and that's kind of how a lot of the historical fantasy kind of works. It's mostly historical, a lot of like the court intrigue, if that's around the time when it's taking place or whatever, most of the historical stuff, and then it just adds a twist of magic into it. So that's a really good one to get into. This one, especially if you're like nervous about magic, this is dragons. This is a good one to try out. Alternative histories are a really good way to go too if you like historical fiction. So I would say Solus by Gail Carriger. This is a steampunk series. So it's history with the steampunk elements, and there is paranormal stuff going on in here, magic, paranormal creatures, you know, werewolves, all that kind of stuff. So if you want to kind of stick to your history but with a twist on it, alternate history is a good way to go. If you're into more literary fiction, there's a ton of literary fantasy out there, but two that I recommend are The Gracekeepers by Kirsty Logan and The Night Circus by Erin Morgenstern. Again, all these recommendations are not the only ones within these genres. You can definitely find things similar to this or different titles within these different subgenres of fantasy and science fiction, but these are just some that I recommend to kind of get you going. Another good place to start is fairy tale retelling. So fairy tales tend to be something that we're really familiar with because of either Disney stories or just growing up hearing fairy tales. So you can look up just Googling such and such retelling and you will find a ton of them. Fairy tale retellings have been very popular for a long time now, so any of your favorite fairy tales have been adapted into different retellings, and you can find those both in YA and adult. And for science fiction, which is the genre that I am less familiar with than fantasy, which is why there's less recommendations, I have certain specific things that I stick to myself within science fiction. Fantasy, I can basically read like any subgenre of fantasy and I'll be totally fine, but I have found that science fiction I have to stick to certain things. So for example, if you really like Star Wars, which means you love space operas, number one, you can find a ton of Star Wars books and spin-off books, especially now since the new trilogy has come out and they're doing all of this like supplemental stuff. So you can find those again both in YA and adult, or you can just look up different space operas. One of my favorites is the Leviathan Wake series by James S.A. Corey. These are a ton of fun. They're bigger, which I'll get to in a second about a tip surrounding that, but they're super easy to fly through and they're space operas. So if you like epic space stories in like movies or whatever, or you watch like TV shows like that, or whatever the case may be, then you can definitely search for those kind of genres within science fiction or fantasy. The second part of this question that I get a lot is how do I go from YA to adult science fiction and fantasy? And this is so much easier because you already know what you like within the subgenres. So again, you can pretty much identify what you're going to like that's an adult science fiction or fantasy story based on what you already read in YA. And there are a ton of videos that are like, if you like this, try that, and you can probably find some recommendations there, but just going off of some of the more popular series, I will just rattle off some right now to kind of get you going. If you loved Six of Crows by Leigh Bardugo, you'll probably love Mistborn by Brandon Sanderson or The Lies of Locke Lamora by Scott Lynch. Mistborn in general is a good, highly recommended crossover between YA and adult. In some places it's marketed as YA and in some places it's marketed as an adult. I consider it an adult series personally, but they have marketed it both ways before, so it's a really good bridge into adult from YA. And although it is a longer series, or longer books at least, that can be a little bit intimidating, his writing style is really easy to get into. The Lies of Locke Lamora is a little bit of a step up writing style wise in my opinion, but still, if you love thieves and morally gray characters and like bands of thieves and heists and stuff, you're gonna like both of these books. If you like The Remnant Chronicles by Mary E. Pearson, I think you would like the Queen of the Tearling series by Erica Johansson. This has less of the romance because, again, we're moving kind of out of YA. That tends to be a little more romance heavy into adult, but it has a lot of the same themes for me. Both of the main characters have a very similar feeling, although this main character isn't trying to run away from her responsibilities like Leah does in The Remnant Chronicles. They have a very similar feel to them and kind of development and arc, and that there's kind of more to the story. They also both take place in a kind of future Earth where there is fantasy and magic, so it has a similar kind of flavor to it. If you grew up on kind of the classic portal fantasies like Narnia or something, there's a couple recommendations for this. The Magician series by Lev Grossman, while the first book I think is a little bit hard to get into, it is really like a love letter to fantasy, the whole series, and I consider the whole series like one giant story. I feel like if you start reading the first one, you have to allow yourself to continue, even though the main characters are really unlikable in the first book especially, but there's so many references to classic fantasy stories as far as like Narnia and some of these portal fantasies that I think you would really enjoy this if you kind of grew up on those more middle grade type stories. Similar to that is the Wayward Children series by Shauna McGuire, which is a series of novellas, and it follows characters who have gone into portal fantasy worlds, gone through a door or a cabinet or something, and then had to come back, got pushed out of their worlds and are either trying to get back or just trying to cope with that. And this kind of gets me into my next tip, which is to start with smaller books anyway. So that is true for either if you're just getting into the genre in general or you're going from YA to adult. A lot of times these series can be very large, or the books can be very large, like over 500 pages, and it can be really intimidating. There is a great series of novellas, not even just this novella series, but other ones that you can get into. So these books, there's probably going to be many of the Wayward Children series, but they're like around 100, 200 pages tops and are super easy to kind of fly through so that you can kind of dip your toes into it. I think another good way to kind of dip your toes into the genre is with comics. So, for example, if you really like Marvel and DC, check out the Marvel and DC comics. That's kind of its own beast, and some people would be intimidated by that as well and wouldn't want to go there. But even outside of Marvel and DC, there are plenty of comic companies that do their own kind of standalone original stories within comics that are science fiction and fantasy, so you can get into those. I have a few that I recommend. If you really like pantheons of gods and goddesses, we have the Wicca and the Divine series, which is an Image comic. If you like darker mythology, I think Monstrous is a great one to go with. If you like space operas, Saga is a great one. And if you like robots, we have Descender or Alex and Ada. Alex and Ada is a little bit more contemporary feeling, slice of life feeling, and Descender is a little more space opera-y feeling. And there is no saying that you have to tackle those big books in order to be into it. There's no rules about like what you need to read. You don't need to read even a certain canon of stories. There's no one series that you really need to read. You don't need to read the classics if you don't want to, and you don't need to read these giant fantasy series especially in order to be like a fantasy fan. I have never read Lord of the Rings, and I might never. I own them. They're right there. I might never read them. I don't really care. I can go either way with it, and I'm still a fantasy fan. I don't have any plans to read Wheel of Time or Malazan. If you go on kind of any fantasy forum, those two are more modern classics that are thrown around a lot. They're not necessary. If you find like these big series like those and Dark Tower and all of these like really intimidating, you don't need to read them. And there are plenty of science fiction and fantasy standalones you can also dip your toes into as well if series are something that's intimidating. So identify what's intimidating for you and then just don't read those right now. Dip your toes into something that feels a little bit safer. I do have a video on my favorite standalones, which I will link on the screen if you want some recommendations for those. And my last tip is just for now to stick to stuff that is well read and well reviewed for the most part. Obviously there's going to be a lot of series that are like polarizing and some people don't love the favorites and all that stuff. But in general, you can identify series that are very popular and series that are recommended a lot or reviewed a lot and kind of stick to those for now. Stick to stuff that's a little bit newer as well. Again, you don't have to go back and read the canon. Maybe stuff that's been within the last 5 or 10 years just because it tends to be a little bit easier accessible. And again, now is not the time to dive into something that you might not know if you like. This is not the time, in my opinion, to go to a library or bookstore and just pick something random off the shelf because you like the cover. Although that could completely work, I think you're setting yourself more up for disaster. You're going to want to read some reviews or watch some videos or whatever and figure out, like, is this something that I think that I will like, so you can give it a fair shot and give the genre a fair shot and try it out. And then later, if you want to get into more like indie books or things like that are self-published or things that you're not as familiar with and that aren't as widely read and reviewed, but kind of figure out which of those subgenres you really like. I've mentioned a ton of subgenres today in this video because this genre of science fiction and fantasy, they are so wide and there's so many subgenres, which is true of any genre in literature. So you can kind of figure out where your favorites sit and then go from there and get recommendations from there. And it can be really intimidating at first, I guess. I've always read science fiction and fantasy, so I've never found it particularly intimidating. The biggest thing has been like the really big books or really big series, but overall, I've always found it a lot of fun. And once you get into it and just get your toes wet, I think it'll be much easier for you to get into it. But just find, like I said, those things are like, if you like this, try that. Stick to what you know, stick to some smaller stuff at first, and then just kind of graduate up from there. And I think you'll be successful if that's what you want to read. So I hope that was helpful. Comment down below, let me know some tips that you have for newbies to the science fiction and fantasy genre. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see all of you guys soon. Bye!